We're ready. We're ready to go. So
Okay,
everybody
great.
doesn't know Rich Seling, you'll know him before the next hour's over. So take it away.
Thank you all for showing up tonight and making the long commute to make it to the meeting. And just so excited to see so many of you and so many people I know, and can't wait till we're all back in person. But for now, this is a great way to get together.
Yep.
So without further ado, host is disabled screen sharing. You want to give me host privileges?
Absolutely.
We'll switch into the slideshow. There we go.
That look okay?
No, actually, you got to give me
I
code.
didn't do it. Sorry.
I'm seeing your screen.
That's not good. All right, let's get back and stop that. And
Bob, go over to Rich's picture and you'll see dots on top. And then under those dots, you click on it. And give them-
there we are. Yeah. Looking but not seeing. Make co-host. Rich, you
There
ought
we
to be
go.
good to go.
All right. Let's share screen here. And you should be seeing a big gray screen that we'll take care of in a second. It looks like we're getting the right warning. So everybody see a big picture of the ocean here?
Yes.
All right, that's what we
Yes.
want to see. So we're ready to go. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is exposure. And specifically, one of the things we're going to drill down into is how small moves create big effects. And I think we got some surprising things in store for you tonight.
Whoops.
Rich, you're muted. Rich, you're muted.
Oh, I got it. That's Rich. Can you unmute yourself?
You got me?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know. I must have hit the wrong quick key there.
No, that was
so-
me. I apologize.
Okay, no worries. So there's always so many quick keys that you can hit the wrong one. So
Yeah.
ubiquitous copyright out of the way. Let's get through that and talk a little bit more about this. For the last 2 years, I found myself looking spending a lot of time looking at the effect of exposure on my photographs, and it's surprisingly improved how I photograph and the look of my photographs like few other things have. So I'm pretty excited about the information tonight just because of the effect I've seen it have on my own photography and the people that I've shared it with on other workshops and things. So tonight, I just want to show you some of what I've learned and how that applies to your photographs. And as we dive into that, I just want to do a quick plug. I've got an upcoming processing workshop coming up starting November 1st. It's 4 sessions. This is all online with Zoom that I'm going to show my color processing. I've done a lot of presentations, one with you guys about black and white, but colors was my bread and butter as a professional printmaker. So I'm going to show you the techniques, the thought process, how to really look at color and get the most out of processing from your color photographs. You can find information for that if you go to my website, richseling.com. And just for anybody that doesn't know me, to connect with me on the socials, richseling.com. My Instagram is just Rich Seling, Facebook, and I got a blog, Crafting Photographs. You can get some more stuff there. And with that out of the way, let's get into tonight's big idea. The big takeaway from tonight is right here. Better exposure will improve your photographs. And I got this little graphic for you here. Pretend you're ordering a nice $6 craft beer at one of the finer restaurants there in our Nashville area. And if you're paying $6 for a nice craft beer, which one of these do you want to be served up on? You want the little one, you want the medium one, or you want the big one? Pretty obvious. I think I know which one I want. I want the full pour of that beer right to the rim and bubbling up. And if it's a Guinness foaming up with that nice, beautiful foam, well, exposure is kind of the same thing. We want to make sure we're getting the full benefit when we're exposing and not shorting ourselves in the process. And the benefits that we're going to look at here from full exposure are processing gets easier, a lot easier. My processing, even spending 30 years in Photoshop, now seems easier than ever and more effortless and easier to tune in with a photograph. You get better shadow detail as a result of this. We'll get into that a little bit more with the whole exposed to the right idea. And the thing that's hard to quantify, but I see it on screen, I see it in prints, is there's more glow or brilliance. There's just a greater richness to the photographs from getting more information from it. And we're sharing across Zoom. We never know how things look here tonight, but I have a couple examples of photographs that from my side, when I look at them, show that. This is actually just from a week ago on the ocean in Florida. And processing for this was just one mild curve to add some contrast, and I added some saturation. This is really pretty close to straight out of the camera with a very accurate exposure. All these are ones that have been exposed to the edge of what's possible with accuracy. Here's another one down at Huntsville, the Space Center. It's basically straight out of the camera, other than converting to black and white. Just fell into place. And picking really great light helps with that, but that is part of making things work too. Fall Creek Falls, this is just some minor exposure adjustment on the exposure slider and adding a little bit of contrast with a contrast curve. Very light adjustments for what you'd expect from a typical adjustment. Again, almost straight out of the camera, it's just a minor contrast adjustment and a little bit of brushing. Here's another one. This is from where I was 2 weeks ago in Blackwater Falls. This is Elikala Falls, beautiful waterfall. Gail's posted some stuff on the Facebook page from here, but this is just one curve that brightened the highlights and a little bit of brushing. I mean, minor, just touching it gently and brings this out. And we're gonna end up here a little bit more complicated example with a really difficult subject, because it's literally a black and white subject. We have these black tiles and these white thermal blankets lit with spotlights on the white and not lit on the dark. So it's a really contrasty scene, exposed carefully to try to get the full dynamic range of the sensor. This is basically straight out of the camera here. And then with a little bit of brushing, it turns into that. So these are not unusual examples for me, even though I've cherry picked ones that illustrate tonight. This is a pretty common thing when everything cooperates, that I get things that just fall into place well if the light cooperates and if I use careful exposure to make things fall into place. So I've convinced you that we all need better exposure and we can all go home. We're done. No, let's unpack this a little bit better, because now we have to answer, how do we do that? And what is correct exposure? And to really answer what is correct exposure, we need to learn how to evaluate our exposure with greater precision. And this question, what is correct exposure? In evaluating your exposure has actually always been an important part of getting successful results. With analog black and white films, some of you might recognize this. There was a tool called a densitometer that let you read very precise readings of your film to see how dense it was and how your processing worked. And that's how Ansel Adams made the zone system work. And it was a very important tool to make sure you were exposing and processing correctly. Processing is linked into analog a little bit differently than it is for us on the digital side. Here's a drum for the Tango drum scanner at my lab that has some 4x5 transparencies on it. And color slide or chrome or E6, it was a bit easier to evaluate because you can just do it on a light box, and correct exposure, you could judge it with the naked eye. It's just basically, you're looking for highlights that hold detail, and you can learn pretty quickly what will hold. If you can see it, basically it will hold on a drum scanner. If it looks like clear film, well, it's clear film and you're not going to get any detail out of that. In these two analog processes, evaluating how well you did was always part of the process. When you're throwing things on the light table, after processing, after getting it back from the lab, you're always looking at this, and it's kind of been subtracted from the digital process. So, and part of the problem is RAW has a problem in that it's really hard in camera to tell exactly what's in the file. You know, you're probably reading your histogram and doing some other things when you're photographing on the playback to look at that, but it's not really giving us as precise a look as these other methods did back in the analog days. And even when we get onto the computer, you know, typically the first look we're seeing in these files is maybe in Lightroom or another processing software, and they're giving us a slightly processed version of that raw file. So we're not really seeing truly what's in there because these tools aren't meant to be an analytical tool like a densitometer is. So we have this question, how do we look at our raw file with none of the processing added in so that we can just really look at what was captured and what is in that file? And to do that, we need a different application. And fortunately, some software developers wrote this program called Raw Digger, and this does exactly what we need. So just quick information on this, to look it up. You can get a 30-day free trial. So if you download it and want to play with it, you don't have to buy it to play with it, which is great. After this, you can download it, play with it, see if you like it or not. There's a couple different versions. I'm just using this 1995 version called the Exposure Edition. So you don't have to buy their like $80 or $100 version. The $20 version has done everything I need, and I use this all the time. For me, it's a foundational tool. I look at every single photograph before I process it. And usually I'm working with a bracket of 3 photographs. So I use this to pick the best exposure of that bracket. That's part of the reason for that, but it gives me a lot of information. So I know what I'm getting into when I get to that processing step. And if you go to rawdigger.com, that's where you can download that. So we're going to do a demo with this in a second, but this main window back here, you can see we've got like a toolbar up across the top, and it has some different things that it tells us what camera we used and the aperture, and then some numbers and some statistics. I want to tell you what some of those are so we can start understanding what it is we're reading here. So once you load an image into Raw Digger, and you can just drag it into it, or you can file open like any other application, it starts to give us some really valuable information about that image. And the ones I use the most are what we're going to look at here. Exposure stats is the first one that I look at, and this shows how many pixels are overexposed. It gives me a good quick read on the file. It also shows underexposed, but I'm really not as concerned with that as I am with overexposed. I'm concerned with where the highlight detail might be burned out. And it reads out both the number of pixels overexposed and the percentage of the pixels for the whole image. So it helps me see if I've exposed too far to the right. And in this little screen grab here, you can see in the red channel, I've got 0 overexposed pixels. In the green, I've got 4 million overexposed pixels. In blue, I've got 1 million. And in green 2, I've got 4 million. And if you're wondering why is there green and green 2, well, your sensor has 2 alternating rows of red, green, green blue, green blue, green blue. So green is the first row, green 2 is that second row as they repeat. So the next piece of information from here is the minimum maximum values for the entire image. And this will show the value of the brightest pixel in the image and the darkest pixel in the image. And it's one way to see if I've exposed far enough to the right or too far. It can also pick up hot pixels, so you do have to be aware of that. But if you've got a decent sensor that's not, older sensors can start to pick up damage over time, but most sensors, you're not going to run into that too bad, but you do have to be aware of that. The other thing that we're going to look at too is the histogram view, and it gives us some tools that change how the histogram is plotted. And I switch into logarithmic mode. The default is linear, which is really similar to what our cameras display, but logarithmic does a better job of showing the high value pixels that can hide when we use that linear display. And they can hide on your camera. Your camera can fool you. And part of what we're going to show tonight gets into that. So I don't trust the view on my histogram. I use a different tool that we're going to get to. It also has these markings. If you look along that bottom edge, you see it says 8,000 and 16,000, and the edge of that green is almost up to that 16,000 mark. Those correspond to the pixel values in the raw file. In this case, this raw file is a 14-bit file, and the 14-bit file, I have to remember always for a second, the pixel values can be from 0 to 16,363, I think. But every camera renders it a little bit differently. So the Sony, the cutoff point is just shy of that 16,000 line, but that's the right. What we're looking here with that spike, that's the right of the histogram. Everything's smashing up against the histogram. This is actually from an overexposed image. And this is another way I can tell that if I've gone far enough to the right, or if I've gone too far to the right. So we've got another valuable tool here when we have the histogram view along the top edge. Look at that top edge and see this number 1, 2, and 3. And there's a gray line in between 1 and 2 and between 2 and 3. These lines correspond to EVs, or exposure values. And EVs are essentially stops. They're one stop apart. So each one of these lines is one stop of exposure. And that gray line in the middle is a half stop. You can set it up for half stops or third stops. This lets us, when we load a file into Raw Digger, see how far we are from being overexposed, or actually in this case, sorry, underexposed from what the optimum is, or where that right is, because we can just count off in EVs how far we were. And it corresponds exactly to what you would do in camera, that if you're a stop and a half under here and you opened up a stop and a half in camera and took another one and read it, that would put it directly where you'd think it would on here for that measurement. So this is one of the most powerful tools, because to be able to measure exposure with this level of accuracy is really pretty crazy. So I want to show you how to find the right in the stops here with a little demo. Let me, we have to free up the screen here and bring up Raw Digger. So here's Raw Digger. And let me choose, let's see, we've got an overexposed. We'll start with the overexposed. Come on. It wants me to update Raw Digger. It doesn't let me drag in the file. Oh no, I picked the correct exposure. We don't want that. We want overexposure. Okay, so window histogram. We bring the histogram up from a second window here, and here's this linear versus logarithmic. Look how this histogram looks now, and we see the spike that we kind of associate with overexposed, but if I switch it to logarithmic, it scales all that up, that I see the information a lot clearer. So this is already telling me I'm overexposed. It's not the exposure that I want to use. So what I want to do is find an exposure that's just a stop darker. So I'm going to go here to the next file in line. And what we find is, did we get the right one? That by going, that's a 1/6 of a second. That's not right. What is going on here? Hang on a second. That should be a 1/5 of a second. We're missing the 1/3 of a second. 6.5. Now, how come I looked at this yesterday and it's doing something different than what? Raw Digger demo files. All right, hang on a second here. Technical difficulties. My brain is disconnecting from what we're looking at in the files. Okay, come on. There we go. 95 there, 1/3 second. That's the one I was looking for. The sort was wrong, so I was grabbing the wrong file. So we'll look back up here. I'm at file 96. We're overexposed. You can look at the over underexposed stats, and I've got 4 million. My max values is for the green. I have a pixel value of 15,864. That's this far right on the green. I'm also at the far right on the blue. And if I just go down one exposure from there, I jump to, there's down a 1/3 of a stop less. And all of a sudden, all this overexposure goes away. And all of a sudden right here where my right was, I'm no longer at it. Let me turn on 1/3 stop grid views. If you look here, see this is between 4 and 3, there's a full stop, and these gray lines are 1/3 stops. There's my 1/3 stop. This is within a 1/6 of a stop of perfect exposure. So this is my best exposure. I'm not going to be able to get better than that. It's without some serious tricks that aren't really suited to working in the field, but in the studio you might be able to. There's no reason. Let's look at one a little bit darker. Actually, let's pick one a lot darker. Here's the same photograph taken at a 1/10 of a second. here to see how much I underexpose this. If I know over here at 16,000, this is my right, well, I just need to count over in EVs. That lines up basically with 3. Here's 1, 2, and a little more than 2 stops underexposed. So if I only had one picture and I plugged that in here and looked at it, I could see, oh, I underexposed this by 2 stops. I could have gone and used more exposure for that in the field. So that's one of the ways I'm using this to evaluate how good I did. It's basically like that light table. Did I capture detail or not? And how close to the right did I get with this? This is how you find out with a very absolute measure of that. So let me switch back into slide mode here. So really, you need to be evaluating your photographs on a regular basis, not as a pass-fail test, but because a good photograph, it doesn't have to be technically perfect, but what you want to be doing is self-assessing how you did so that you can learn how you could grow, what maybe you could do different, where you could improve, where you're doing a great job. Without that information, you're really lacking part of the feedback loop that is part of growing and learning as a photographer. So we want to see how well you exposed. We're gaining information for how to expose in the future. And the thing I said before, it's guidance for processing. If I know I have highlight detail in from here, and then I get into Lightroom or Photoshop and it looks blown out, well, I know that's because it's already thrown some processing in and I've got to back out. I know there's detail because if I saw it in Raw Digger, there absolutely is detail in that file, regardless of what I'm seeing in that processing software. And that certainty, for me at least, gives me confidence and gives me assurance when I'm photographing that I'm not wondering. And frankly, that's one of the hardest parts in photography is when you don't have an accurate enough piece of knowledge about what you're doing that you're wondering, you're guessing, is it going to come out? Did I get what I want? I hate being in that place because I can't assure that I'm going to be able to communicate what I want to communicate. So whenever I can get information that gives me more certainty about what's going on, I find it extremely helpful. So this all gets into this idea of exposed to the right, or ETTR. I'm sure most of you have heard of this, but what I think you're going to be surprised with is how even small moves can greatly affect your success in achieving that goal. And just a quick review, if you're not familiar with this, histogram, my take on it is it's a rough measure, unless you're in Raw Digger like we looked at. On the back of the camera, there's a lot of ways it can lie to you. When I'm looking at it, I don't look at it actually in Lightroom or Photoshop when I'm processing. It's not as precise as other ways. Really what exposed to the right means is we're trying to fill up every sensor, every pixel on our sensor as full as possible without overflowing. We're trying to get the brightest exposure we can that still holds highlight detail where we want it. Maybe not highlight detail everywhere. We might choose to blow out some highlight detail, but we want to make sure where we want highlight detail, we have it, and we're exposing it as bright as we can for that. So back to the graphic we were looking at, if you paid $6 and for a really nice microbrew, like the Black Abbey Stout is a really nice one I've found. If I paid $6 and got this, I wouldn't be too happy about it. And if I complained and they poured a little bit more, I mean, maybe I'm an optimist and this is half full, but I'm still not going to be really happy about it. I'd rather have a full glass. And the surprising thing is this is literally what's happening with the amount of light your sensor is collecting. From going from this barely full glass to kind of half full to full happens a lot quicker than you're going to believe, even faster than I believe. This is some new information that I've dug in even further in the last week and pulled out here. And this is why we expose to the right. We want more information per pixel in highlights and shadows. The more it's filled up, the more information we get. That gives us cleaner data. It gives us more shadow information, which is always good. Everybody's always trying to get more information out of the shadows, and real information's always better than what we can process out of it. And when we do all that, the processing just becomes a lot easier in most cases. So the question we have is, how accurate do we need to be when we're exposing? I know it's in the color slide film days when I used to carry a view camera around and have a little spot meter. And I knew that if I was within a half of a stop of correct exposure, I could have blown out highlight details. So I'd meter as carefully as I can, and then I'd take 3 exposures, one what I thought would be correct, 1 half stop brighter and 1 half stop darker as a bracket to hopefully take out any errors I made in metering or errors in processing or errors in the shutter. There's a lot of errors that can come in there. I was used to really accurate processing, but digital, I think, has made us all take advantage of the fact that we can get a usable image being fairly underexposed, and we don't even really realize it. But how accurate do we need to be to start getting better results? So this bracket we were looking at earlier, I'm going to show you how quickly we start losing data. And we looked at this photograph. This was our overexposed one at 0.5 seconds. It's just slightly overexposed. And you can see that back on the right of the histogram, that wall that it's smashing up against. So this is our too far to the right. We want exposed to the right. We don't want too far to the right. So here's our overexposed. So what if I just stop down 1/3 of a stop? This is 0.3 seconds. That's a third stop less. I'm not overexposed anymore. I'm slightly off the very brightest I could be, but I'm within like a 1/6 of a stop, as I was saying before. This is really as perfect as you can get real world stats. And even at this level of accuracy, I've only filled up the sensor to 89% of what the processor is capable of. I've got a pretty full glass, but it's not even full to that last full measure, but it's pretty close. So this is what exposed to the right looks at. Here's where it gets pretty surprising though. What if I stop down, just a third more? What if I'm off by 2/3 of a stop from that best exposure? Just going down a third of a stop in our previous frame drops the maximum value of our brightest pixel to 9,000 out of a possible 15,000. And what that means is we've actually lost half of our possible information here. This is about 58% actually of the maximum information. So a little more than half, but 1/3 stop took us from 89% of the best our sensor can do to 58% of the best the sensor can do. So that's a pretty big jump for what I would think a third of a stop should not have that much of an effect. So what if we go even another third stop darker? Now we're 1 stop less than overexposed, and that drops the maximum value to 5,672 here. And at that point, I'm only capturing 36% of the sensor's full potential. So I'm getting about 1/3 of what the sensor is capable of. And as a result of that, what we've done is we've moved the shadow detail, not only it's a highlight not captured as richly as possible, the shadows moved into a significantly more noisy range of capture with a lot less information. So we're trying to pull that out with processing. It doesn't respond the same. And all this happens just from perfect exposure, a third stop darker, and we're already starting to lose 2/3 stop darker than that perfect. We're down to 1/3 of the possible information we can get out of the sensor, which is, to me, is just shocking that it's that critical. Now, that doesn't mean this wouldn't be a usable exposure. And I bet if you look through your archives, you've got things that are like this. I've processed things for professionals from things a stop or 2 stops underexposed that beautiful work can come from. So it's not a judgment of, is this a good photograph or not? But are we getting the most potential out of it so we can learn to get the most potential of it? That's what we're trying to learn here. And basically learning, it's actually really critical how precisely we expose. So if our highlight value is only filling our sensor this full, think about where if the highlight line is that top line, where's the shadows? I mean, it's like down on the bottom of the glass. So again, just these small moves, the impact here, perfect. We get 89% of the sensor potential with this particular exposure. Maybe you're going to get a little bit better, a little bit worse sometimes. Third of a stop darker, we're within 58% of the full potential. Stop down 2/3 stop again, 36% of the potential. It's really that glass is what's happening with your sensor. It's either really full of pixels that it's counted or photons of light, or it's about half full, or it's about 1/3 full, and it starts dropping that quickly. So that gets us to how do we make better exposures? Because that's all well and good. We're here back in the comfort of the studio, and it's easy to second guess what we did or look at it. How do we do it better in the field? And the tool that I use is, it starts with how we measure exposure in the camera. And we can gain a lot more accuracy by switching to using highlight warnings instead of the histogram. I found that highlight warnings are the most accurate preview we can get, because they turn on, and or the blinkies, some people call it, they start blinking at you in small areas of blown out detail before the histogram will show anything, particularly if there's very small detail. And until they build raw digger into our camera or something like it, which they should give us better tools, but they're not yet, the blinkies or highlight warning is really the best way to tell if you've overexposed or underexposed, because you'll see those highlight warnings turn on. And using highlight warnings, it allows us to do what I call finding the blink, no blink split. And that's basically, I want to find the darkest exposure that still has highlight warnings. And then I want to find the exposure that when I stop down a half stop or a third stop, depending what your camera's set to, then gives me no highlight warning or brightness warning on that. So I'm trying to basically using it like a Polaroid back in the old days, trying to find where too bright is. And I'm just taking one step back from that to find that no blink split.
Hey, Rich.
And yeah, go ahead.
I'm out just a second. You're talking about using, and I don't know if anyone else has this issue, but what type of metering are you using when you look for the blinkies? Are you doing an area metering, or are you doing spot?
Actually, that's a great question. What metering mode doesn't matter, because this is in playback. It doesn't care how you metered it. It's just showing you what it captured. So you're basically taking a test picture and then you're playing it back and you're reviewing it to look for that. So how you metered it doesn't matter to find the blinkies. And then it would just change then how you want to modify that exposure. Myself, I'm almost always in manual. So I actually don't even try to meter. I just use the blinkies. I take a picture as quickly as I can. I make it look roughly right on the viewfinder, take a picture as quickly as I can. Did I get blinkies or not? And I either, if I didn't get blinkies, I add some more exposure and I keep exposing until I get blinkies. And then I find that one where they turn off and on. So that's how I do it. But metering, auto, aperture, manual, shutter, priority, program, none of those matter, because what we're looking at is the playback of the actual image to tell us whether we did a good job or not.
Rich, on that score, does the creative style, I'm talking about Sony, I don't know what it is in other products, but the creative style, whether you use neutral, vivid, landscape, does that have an impact?
You're jumping ahead on me, Rick.
I'm sorry.
You get the gold star. No, we're going to cover that in a second. So let me hit that when the slide comes up. That's a great question. So important one. All right, anything else before everybody following along here? Because if you're not, stop me. We've got lots of time, and making sure that we're getting everything clear is the most important thing here. So
Can I ask one more question then?
yeah.
You mentioned bracketing before.
Mm-hmm.
If you do bracketing, how many stops and how many photos do you take in your bracket, and what's the stops that you use?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you might have, I'll give you the short answer now and then come back if you want more, but most of what I photograph doesn't move on me, so I can get away with bracketing. If you're photographing wildlife or people, you can't bracket, because you're trying to get that exact moment where the expression or the animals, how they're moving is there. But if it's not if I can set the tripod down and it's not going to run out of my frame, I can bracket. And typically I'm going for a 3-frame bracket. I'm trying to find this no blinky. And in the case of my camera, we're going to talk a little bit about exposure calibration. My light meter, you know what? Ask me this at the end. We're going to jump too far ahead. So I don't want to confuse what we're on now, and we'll fit it in with the next part. So One we'll answer in line. The other one you got to come back in and answer. So, and ask, because I'll forget as I start talking here. Okay, so let me look at this and then we can keep, actually, anybody else got any other questions before we go on?
Hey, Rich, I had a question. I have taken pictures before and I would get quite a few blinkies and I thought I had blown out the image, but actually when I'm looking at the image on the back of the camera, it's a JPEG, not the RAW. So then when I downloaded it in my computer, I realized I didn't overexpose it. I still had a lot of information. And I was curious, should I go by the blinkies from that JPEG on the back of my camera?
Yeah, so you know what? That's another one. We're gonna ask me at the end if we haven't answered that one, because everyone, this is great. Everybody's jumping ahead, which means you're following along or you have the pieces that you're fitting together. So let's we'll get that at the end because that is part of what we want to answer. Okay, anybody else? I think they hacked my computer and took the presentation here, Bob. That's okay. So
Yeah, it's a shifty bunch.
what this blinky, no blinky
How can that be?
side by side is a really important part of the process for me. And what that looks like here, and hopefully it's coming across on Zoom, on the left, I've got no blinkies at 1/90th of a second. And on the right, I've just got a couple little black spots you can see on that white
Oh,
square
give me a
that are
fucking
showing
break.
up at 1/125th of a second. So what I'm trying to find is where's that when I get the blinkies and I go a half a stop, in this case darker, or a third of a stop, they go away. I'm trying to find where that split is between those two. And if I can find that, then I know where I'm at with my exposure, and it's a very safe exposure
That's
on every camera that I've run into having no blinkies. So we get into some other challenges though here too that jumped ahead. There we go.
10-yard penalty.
Oh, somebody's got their microphone on. I'm hearing some background noise. So there's the blinkies are
Jim
generated.
Havens, turn your mic off. Thanks.
The blinkies are generated by a JPEG preview of a RAW file that our camera is making. And there's a lot of things that affect how that JPEG looks. And we can improve how accurate both our highlight warning, which is what I care about. If you're looking at the histogram, I don't care about the histogram on the camera, but it'll improve that as well. The first one is setting up your camera to Adobe RGB instead of sRGB. sRGB is a little bit contrast to your space, the way it's maps out the space. Adobe RGB is less contrasty. So if you do that in camera, this doesn't affect your RAW file. Everything's still in there. You can use ProPhoto in editing, which is what I recommend actually for editing. It's just we're tuning the camera to display our histogram and our blinkies that preview JPEG a little bit accurately. And then this is what Rick was asking here. Some cameras let you pick a rendering style, or they call it a profile, or they've each got their own name for it. It's not like a ICC color profile. It's like vivid or landscape or saturation or neutral or standard. Fuji has a lot of these that they're named after, like you can pick Velvia or Provia or their color neg film. So all these, if you pick it in camera, will affect that JPEG preview it's making, and it will affect your histogram and how those blinkies are displayed. And generally, you want to set this to a standard or neutral profile for the best results in camera. If you have like the Fuji cameras, if you've got Velvia, for example, which is there's a bit of contrast in Velvia. That's what made Velvia film look the way it is. You're going to see those highlight warnings turn on before you're really at the right of the histogram. So you're not going to get accurate information. You're actually going to be underexposing the photograph, and which is one of the things we're going to answer. Somebody asked a little bit more in there that some of you have already seen in your own cameras. And if it just turns them on too easy, or Vivid will do the same thing. So I just go with the default that's standard on my Sony. Some people use a neutral instead. The other thing that helps here is auto white balance, because if your preview or if your white balance is set to something that's pretty far off from what the real white balance of the scene is, it's going to give you inaccurate information on what's blown out. I had this happen to me with that first photograph on the beach. I had it set, somehow I bumped the settings and I wasn't in auto white balance and everything was very blue. And it was showing me all these things were blown out, that when I just switched the white balance to auto white balance and took another one, all of a sudden nothing was blown out at exactly the same exposure. So the accuracy of your white balance affects that too. So I find that just being in auto white balance does a good job of reducing that error. I'm sure somebody's going to find a place where it won't work, but it's worked really, really well for me for the last 2 years. So there's always disclaimers. But the other thing that somebody asked here, and this so we can dive into that, is, you know, you've seen maybe blinkies or no blinkies on your camera, and you found that there was a lot more highlight information in there, even though your camera led you to believe you've overexposed. So that's pretty common. Every camera has in a slight safety measure so that you don't overexpose. And these blinkies are a great starting point. And if you want to start just improving today, you'll do a better job most likely than the ways you're exposing by starting to trust those. But it doesn't mean you're necessarily exposing all the way to the right. To do that, you actually need to test your light meter. What we found on the last workshop, we did this with everybody's camera 2 weeks ago in West Virginia. Everybody had pro model cameras, and we were within 1/3 to 2/3 of a stop accuracy for where those blinkies turned on. So if somebody had the no blinky exposure, some of those were underexposing by 1/3 of a stop. Some of them were underexposing by 2/3 of a stop. Where that is, though, is unique. All those things we just looked at here, it depends on how you've set up your camera. It depends on whether you set it up in Adobe RGB, what profile you had, where your white balance setting was. All those things could be affecting that. That really, in the end, you need to actually test your own camera and find out how much headroom it is. I've seen a couple people have been on a workshop I did 2 years ago on this. I've seen some amateur model cameras like the EOS Rebels. I'm not picking on Canon. I've seen it on some of the Sony Pros as well, be off by a stop or more. And in fact, my Sony camera A7R2, it's a pro model made for high resolution. It underexposes by a stop, even with all those things changed, if when I have the no blinky. So I've calibrated my camera. I know that if I find the no blinky, I'm actually one stop underexposed. And I use that then to make a better decision to, usually in the case I'm making a bracket, I open up a stop and take a picture. Then I take one a little bit darker, and then I take one, you know, a half stop darker again. So they have one as bright as I think it can get, a little bit darker for safety, and a little bit darker just in case if things really didn't work out well. That's my ultimate fail-safe, you know, backup parachute on that. So testing how to do that, this is a good time to question. So I don't know who asked that question, but you said you were finding out with your highlight warning when it was on, you still had highlight detail, right?
That was Tony's question.
That was Tony. You still there, Tony?
Yeah, yes, I'm still here, Rich. Yes, I did
great.
have details still, and it was a white image I was actually photographing.
Yeah, so that's what was happening, is that how accurate that highlight warning is. It's a good default starting place, but there's still not, it's not dialed in exactly accurate because they're afraid, the camera manufacturer is afraid you're going to overexpose and you're not going to be happy. So pro cameras, they give you just a little bit of headroom, and that's where kind of this idea has come out that we can recover the highlights. Well, we're not really usually recovering the highlights. They're there, they're not. It's just our camera hasn't told us that it actually was capturing detail. It was telling us things were blown out when they weren't, and it was just there in the file all along. So that's what you're running into. And then the question becomes, to get more accuracy, well, where with your settings, with all those things we looked at, is your camera saying its correct exposure? Is it, you know, how much is it lying to you basically? Is it lying to you about with 1/3 of a stop, a half a stop, 2/3 of a stop, a whole stop. Where is that point? And that's what you have to do to get more accuracy out of the process. So,
Thanks.
and oh, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, and how to do that, it's something that's, I'll give you a little bit because with time, we've got a little bit of time just to talk about the basics, but it's a whole process to go through. Basically what you do is you shoot a series of test exposures, you read them in raw digger, and then you correlate it to what you see on the back of your camera. Where's the no blinky, where's the blinky, and you can then from that determine how your camera is actually displaying things on your camera. Really what all our cameras should be doing is giving us that raw digger view. It should be giving us how many pixels are overexposed, not based from a JPEG, but reading that raw file. And it should be giving us some other little pieces of information in there that let us determine it a lot better. Part of that's just because processing power, for most of the history of digital photography, there hasn't been a strong enough computer in these cameras to do it. Although that's going to be is already changing. If you get the really high end like Hasselblad cameras that, which one is it that has like Lightroom built in that can run it? No shortage of processing horsepower there. They could probably do it today, but we've just kind of fallen into a paradigm of the histogram's good enough. But back to those full glasses, it's not good enough because figuring out 1/3 of a stop off that histogram like that to lose that much information, I don't know how to do it. I only know how to do it from the blinkies. And then even with the blinkies, I have to calibrate the blinkies to try to get around what the camera is trying to show me. So you can hack your way to that calibration yourself, but I got an online on-demand workshop for this. It's basically an ebook with some walkthrough videos. If you go to my website and then on the tab for on-demand learning, you can see that if you want to take that to that next level. But first step is getting you to see that, is that accuracy even worth the effort? Because it's about an hour to do the test, and then it changes how you photograph. But for me, what it's done now that I know with the test run on each of my cameras, I know exactly where that exposure, what it's telling me, whether it's at how accurate it is or not. In the case of my main camera, it's 1 stop underexposed. So I know every time if I find that blink, no blink split, and I found my no blink and the exposure for that, I know I can open up 1 stop. I still have highlight detail. I can take the picture and I'm right at the edge. There's not much safety net, but I can take that and that pushes it as far to the right. In circumstances where maybe things are a little more dynamic and things are moving around or the subject's moving around, maybe I want to make a controlled underexposure, but it lets me make a decision about that I'm choosing where that exposure point is with better information instead of just guessing that, oh, I think this is okay. And maybe like there was an example, somebody had one of the new cameras, people are always doing the test things online, and here's the files from, Nikon's, Canon's new camera. And the file they had in the studio was like 2 stops underexposed when I threw it into raw digger. It's like, man, this doesn't really show me what this camera does at all. It's like, you're guessing. I don't want to be in that place. if I'm 2 stops underexposed, I want it to be because I chose to be 2 stops underexposed for a reason. And maybe there are some reasons, but if I don't want to be 2 stop underexposed, I don't want to be. I want it to be my choice in doing all of that. So that is what we have for tonight. But we've got a bit of time here left for Q&A and looking back through this. Anybody got some questions or want to look at some of this a little bit more? Actually, let me show you one more demo because I'm realizing with the time, I've always got some extra pieces here up my sleeve. I'll show you this bracket. This is from this spring in the Smokies, and this is a pretty typical bracket. It actually led to a photograph that's in my portfolio now. So my bracket, I started off, here's the first exposure. You can see from the number 730. I ended up taking 4. So this was kind of my find out where I am exposure. And the first one, I'm looking from here. I'm a stop and 2/3 underexposed. On the back of my screen on the camera in the field, I wouldn't have been getting any blinkies. So I'd know you know what, I've got quite a bit more to go. I can add more exposure. So let me open up another half stop. And you can, like up here, this is a third of, excuse me, 0.3 seconds. So I opened up to a half a second, and that moved me over more. Here's my right again at 16,000, or the 3 EV. That got me within a stop. That probably had no blinkies on it. So at that point, I'm like, well, I still haven't found the blinkies. I want to find that blinky, no blinky split. So I'm going to open up another half stop. So I'll drag in the next one, which should be 0.7 seconds. And there, all of a sudden, I'm only 2/3 underexposed. This one would have had blinkies turned on. And at that moment, I would have known exactly where I was for my camera with exposure. I would have known that the picture I took before is a stop underexposed. I'd know that this one is probably about a half a stop underexposed. In this case, it was about a third stop, but I use half stops on my camera, which is a good question to ask in a second. So I know both of these are good exposures, but they're not as far to the right. So what I would do in that case is open up again another half stop, and that's this file. This should be 1 second. And at 1 second, you can see here, there's the third stop line. I'm within about a 1/6 of a stop of the right. And for me, that's the point where it's like, you know what? I'm so close to the right, I don't worry about getting one over, because this is so consistently accurate. I know that was as close as I could get. If I would have opened up another half stop, I would have been over, I would have been there. So that's where I didn't take another one. But that's getting back to, I think it was Rick's question, that's what my bracket looks like. In this case, it was 4 exposures, just because that first one, the bracket's actually this, but the bracket I actually made as I photographed, because it was that first exposure was, where the heck even am I with exposure? Because I'm looking at the back of the screen, I'm looking at the, the live view histograms there, but I ignore it. It's got the plus or minus for over and under exposure. But I'm looking for, okay, I just had to take a picture and look at it for blinkies. There's no blinkies. Okay, open up another half stop. Okay, open up another half stop. Still no blinkies. Open up another half stop. Oh, I've got blinkies. Okay, so I know where I'm at, like I was saying before. My next one is going to be the brightest I can get. Open up another half stop. Boom, I've got my blinkies. And right there, I've made my bracket as part of discovering what the correct exposure is. I'm done at that point, and I can move on and make the next photograph. So really quickly, I'm not spending a lot of time, like on workshops, I see people spend a lot of time after exposing their photograph and looking at it and trying to read the histogram. I'm making, like, within a second, I can make that judgment. Did the blinkies come on or not? If they didn't, boom, open up a half stop, take another. As soon as I can hit the playback button, I hit the playback button. Did the blinkies come on or not? And then I can make the next decision. So I'm making these 3 exposures as quickly as physically I can, just spending a second or two evaluating it. At the end, maybe if I really want to be sure, I'll take a quick look and make sure, okay, so I've got a no blinky, I've got one a half stop brighter, I've got one a stop brighter for my camera is the calibration tells me I need to do. But I'm doing this really quickly, and this is one of the things we talked about, the benefits of processing. It helps my processing be easier because the file's so good, but in the field, it helps me work quicker because I have absolute confidence that I got the correct exposure, that I'm not sitting there wondering, is it right, is it not? Do I need to shoot a couple more brackets? Again and again, I'm able to get within, if I'm set up in half stops, I'm within a half stop accuracy or better on my brightest exposure. So I'm as far to the right as I can get. I know I'm there, and that frees me that there's not that doubt. That is, doubting creativity is one of the most destructive things I've found you can have, whether you're a photographer, a writer, a painter, musician, it really doesn't matter. Even in work and things we do, doubt is destructive. I can remove that doubt, and I know with certainty, at least the exposure I did right. Hopefully I didn't kick the tripod and make it vibrate or those other parts, but I can know with certainty I've made the correct exposure, and then I can move on to the next photograph, which is really important because when the light's moving quickly, the best light doesn't last long. You got to work quickly. And if the light's great still after you've made the photograph, well, don't waste that opportunity. I want to move on and make another photograph. So I want to take that photograph as quickly as I can and move on to finding what that next photograph is. And this tool has helped me work so quickly that I'm usually done exposing my photograph when I'm exposing with other people before people have evaluated even their first frame. So that's another one of those big benefits that I was talking about at the beginning that comes out of this for me.
Couple of questions, Rich. This has been in color. Is there also another set of data here that you would use for a black and white image?
Yeah, really good question. In this case, it doesn't really matter because the file, as long as the sensor has not overexposed, it doesn't matter in the end whether it's black and white. It still matters though getting as much information. And what I'm finding, with the color I see it, but I see it, black and white's been a passion of mine for many, many, many years.
Mhm.
What I see is these black and white images just have so much more depth and so much more tonality because of that really far to the right exposure, because I've filled up that sensor so much. But I don't have to change the technique. The same technique works whether I end up processing it for color or for black and white.
Okay. The other question that was sent, I think you've touched on, but might bear repeating, is do you have any special white balance settings for exposing to the right, or are you 100% in auto?
You know, I just leave it in auto. The only time I don't use auto is if I'm doing video, where I don't want that white balance bouncing around. As you move around, video will do that. Video is not what we're talking about, so delete what I just said. In still, for the last 2 years, I just leave it in auto unless I forget to change it back to auto or bump the settings. But auto white balance for me on my Sony has worked exceedingly well because it gets it close enough every time. You know, when I process, I'm fine tuning that white balance. But in camera, as far as giving me that accurate JPEG that gives me a good preview, I've found it gets me close enough. And then with that bracket, I've got my insurance on that as well. You know, and that's I should emphasize too, the challenge is, like we talk about exposed to the right, I think about the right not as this wall that we run into, although that's a good analogy, but more like a cliff of once you go over the right, you're like Roadrunner or Wile E. Coyote. You're, you know, spinning your legs and hoping you can get back, and you're going to fall like a lead brick. I don't want to go over that cliff. So if I'm going to walk right up, or if, like we were talking about Yosemite earlier, some people are really comfortable walking right out to the edge of a cliff. I'm not. I get about 2 feet back and I'm down on my knees and my belly, kind of crawling up to look over the edge, because it's kind of scary being near a cliff. If I'm going to go right to the cliff, I only do it as a bracket to have that insurance. If I can't bracket, I'm going to take a safe step back from that edge, depending on what that is, depends on the circumstances, but I don't want to get bit going up to that edge. And even though this has worked exceedingly well for me, walking right up to the edge every time with this process, there's always that chance you can get bit, and you have to be aware of that, because nothing works perfectly 100% of the time. 60% of the time, 100% of the time, it works 60% of the time, something like that.
Okay. Rich, on the raw digger chart, maybe I was just taking a nap while you were doing this, but the 16,000 mark is the one that you're working on. What is the significance of that? Is that you're talking about the film speed basically from film days, or the ISO settings?
No, what this is mapping is the maximum pixel value in the image, and that depends on the bit depth that the image was captured in. So like in Photoshop, your info palette will usually read 0 to 255. That's the 8-bit scale. Most cameras will let you capture in 12 or 14-bit files, and that changes the scale. 14, it's if there's any software engineers here, or binary, a 14-bit number system lets you have numbers from 0 to 16,636. Hopefully I have that
Okay.
memorized correctly.
Sorry.
So that's the number scale of possible pixel values. So that's how many counts it can have when you're filling up that glass. It can have divisions from 0 to 16,000, but that depends on your camera. So my camera can do 14-bit, 16,000 is my number. If I remember right, and I have it in my draft of the ebook, if you're 12-bit, I think it's 0 to 8,000. If you have like the Hasselblad cameras will do a true 16-bit, and some of the other cameras are starting to do that. That's 0 to, I think it's 64,000. So that number varies. It's not ISO, it's the numbers that it can have in the scale from black to white in that bit depth file. So like the 8-bit file, 0 to 255, 0's black, 255's white. Here, that 16,000, that's white, 0's still black.
Okay. How do we know what our camera relates to? Is that in the specs on a
That-
camera? For instance, yours, you have a Sony.
Mhm.
Are all those Sony, that Sony family 14-bit?
It depends on what settings you have on the back. Like actually mine can do 12-bit or 14-bit. And I know
Okay.
some of the Nikons you can choose like with RAW, 12 or 14-bit. What you have to do is basically figure out for your camera where that is. And how you do that is you take an overexposed frame. I'll take this really completely overexposed frame, because the challenge is technically 14-bit is 0 to 16,000 and change. But in practice, the camera manufacturers don't really hit that final value. So like here, look at the histogram, we've got that spike. Nothing is brighter than that line. We've hit full exposure.
Yeah.
But if I go over here with the maximum value of the brightest pixels in those, it's not 16,000 and change, it's 15,864. So for this Sony in 14-bit, that's the maximum value. For a Nikon in 14-bit, it's slightly different. For Canon, it's slightly different by just, it's like 15,000 and like 732 or 15,900. But if you want to know exactly to that last inch where it is, you just have to take an underexposed frame, throw it in Raw Digger, look here at the max value, and that will give you the maximum possible pixel value that your camera will record, even though by the numbers it should be 16,000 and change. It's just your camera maps it differently. There's a reason for that, but it's probably more than you want to know.
Okay. There was a comment that Kevin says that it considered using a magenta filter to counter the green bias on the sensor. Is there any benefit to doing that?
So Kevin, you want to turn your mic on and tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking?
Yeah, let me unmute here. It's just when I had my 300, I just noticed I went through the trouble of setting up uni white balance, and everything is just so green.
Okay.
And it just made me think, well, if you put a magenta filter on green, that'll kind of cause that'll kind of suck up the green and allow the reds and the blues to come through more. But I've never gone through the trouble of trying it. And I just wonder if you have, and whether you found any kind of benefit from doing that.
So are you talking actually physically putting a filter on the camera, or in processing using something?
No, actually putting a magenta filter on so
On the
that you can
lens.
actually expose longer and get more red and blue in your raw image.
Okay. Well, and then I think that's the curveball in there. So you're saying get more red and blue in the image, because what you're talking about, I'm going to bring up another file here, like in the case of.
And it depends on the image, but I just noticed that most times when I go into Raw Digger, your green is the first thing to run out.
Yeah, that's because it's green picks up the
two greens
luminosity the
and a
most.
red and a blue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, these being off is just part of the color of it. So you'd basically be introducing a problem to try to move that histogram to the right, and then you'd have to try to correct it out with software. I haven't done it, but everything that I know tells me that's not a good idea. So it's,
Okay.
we don't have to have all of these as far to the right. We're just trying to get the one that, whatever, depending on the image, you're going to run into some image. Like if you had a red subject matter, the red would be likely
Yeah.
the one all the way to the right. And
Yeah.
also it has to do with some really complex stuff with the sensor. It doesn't really matter which one of these is all the way to the right. We're just picking whichever one is furthest to the right. And we
Yeah,
base
but
it on
9
that.
times out of 10, I'll find it's green that hits first.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I see too. So that's all you have to worry about. We don't have to try to worry about pushing the others. We just want everything to be in sync together and be as far over as it can. And if the green
Yeah.
is the first that hits that wall, that's okay. Even if, like in this case, here green is further over and red's almost a stop less and blue's about a third of a stop less, that's okay, because that's actually what's making up the color in our camera. If we balance those out, it would make the color all screwy in our
Well,
image.
you would have to, if you did shoot with a magenta filter, you would have to post correct it. You would have to change the color balance afterwards. I don't have a magenta filter, so I've never tried it, and I've
Yeah.
never, it's never been bothered me enough to actually go out and actually buy a magenta filter. If I
Yeah.
had one, I'd give it a try.
It's with everything, you never know until you try, but I don't
Yeah.
think it's probably the most productive path. But
Okay.
who knows? Try it and find out if you're really interested. But where I think you'd run into trouble is you'd start to introduce problems that might be harder to correct out
Yeah.
than in the processing side, because you're putting a magenta, the challenge is that Bayer matrix sensor with the red, green, and blue pixels around each other. You're pushing the red and the green, or the red and the blue, towards more magenta as well. And then they're going to see the color differently. And I think you probably wouldn't get as clean and rich a color out of it as soon as you introduce that cast to it. So trying to get everyone as far to the right is not our goal. We're just trying to get whichever one is furthest to the right as close to the edge, and the other two just come along for the ride, whatever those are.
Okay, that's really good. Hey, follow-up question for you, Rich. I've never shot with a Fuji, but they use those X-Trans sensors. Have you ever used those, and do you have to treat them a little differently when you do work like this?
No, the same thing will work. So they just, how you process the images out of it a little bit different, but Raw Digger reads them just as well. So Raw Digger, it doesn't matter. Actually the earlier X-Trans, I'm blanking on the name, but there's an application that lets you convert it from raw without that looks a little bit more normal. Adobe's raw processor, I don't really like the look of that as much.
X-Transformer.
Which one is it?
X-Transformer.
X-Transformer, that's it. Thanks, Scott. I would look at that for processing it, but as far as this, it doesn't really affect how exposed to the right works or how things work with Raw Digger. It works exactly the same.
Thanks a lot, Rich.
Yeah, you bet.
Wow.
Hey, Rich, can I ask one fast question?
Yeah.
On your picture you have here with the waterfall or the water, how about if you say to yourself that I know that if I use a fifth of a second, that's the kind of way I want the water to look.
Okay.
Okay. What are you going to do at this point? You're just going to adjust your f-stops, or what do you do to process it? Because you know that the speed you want that water to be at is a fifth of a second.
Yeah, that's a good question. It gets back to that whole, the exposure triangle of, if you change one, you've got to change the other. So if I wanted to lock down my shutter speed of the fifth of a second, but the image then was too bright, I'd need to put some neutral density on it, or I'd need to stop down more. So I'd need to do or lower the ISO if that, if I was at a higher ISO, I need to use one of those other controls, the other legs of that, to darken it down if I picked that very specific shutter speed that I wanted. And that is one of the problems in this kind of situation that you run into, is exactly that. You want to freeze the motion at a specific shutter speed, so you have to start fiddling around with the other ones to get you there. So, and that'll just depend then on your scene, you know, at a fifth of a second, you know, what aperture are you at? What ISO are you at? Is it brighter than you want or darker than you want? And then just adjust accordingly.
How are you stopping down a quarter of the stop? I notice you're doing it with time. Do you just know that increment in time is equivalent to a quarter of a stop?
Oh, you know, that's a good question. So are you looking like right here where it tells you what the
Yes.
exposure is?
Yes.
So the Sony cameras will let you, at least my Sony will let you choose half stop or third stops. I'm not doing quarter stops. Uh-oh, we just lost video. You should still have audio.
Yeah, we still
Let's
see
see
it.
here. Let's see if I can swap batteries. We might have gone too long on that battery. I'm using the Sony A7R2 as the webcam, and it doesn't charge the best from the USB, even though it's plugged into one. Let's see if that comes back. If it doesn't, we'll cheat here. We'll give this a second. We're on. Yeah, we're not. Let's try unplugging it and plugging it back in quick. Here, let me look at preferences really quick. Where do I get preferences when I'm not in screen
See your
share?
cursor moving.
Yeah, my cursor's moving. I mean, I'm just not seeing the picture of me. So where is? Hang on a second. I'm going to stop screen share. That will give me back the Zoom menu, preferences, video. There we go. All right, we'll switch to the built-in camera. Not the best, but it'll let us do what we need to do. And let's switch back here to the raw or the raw digger so you can see. Wait, are we sharing? Share screen.
Yeah, you had it up.
There we go. Okay, good.
Okay.
So that's just the half stops on the shutter speed. I'm moving the dial, you know, the little thing, one click, and that moves me a half of a stop. So I can do half stops or third stops. I've chosen to work in half stops, one, because I have all the half stops memorized and I can compute exposures in my head. I work with landscape. I work in manual 99.9% of the time. So, and I can, from years and years of using a 4x5 and a light meter, I can communicate or I can calculate exposure really quickly. And I like that manual hands-on. So I'm in manual and I can just click it one click and I'm a half stop and click another one. And I've found, I'm assessing this, but for the time being, I think a half a stop is accurate enough to get me as far to the right. And it lets me work quicker. I'm kind of revisiting that based on seeing just how critical this is, because it's you know, you want to be as far to the right as possible, but that's how I'm getting that half stop. So it's just the camera, or with aperture, you know, the dial again lets me do it in half or third stops depending on how the camera is set up.
Okay, so perhaps using it in aperture will give you something that you're not getting. I can only do it with a full stop.
Really? What camera do you have?
Pardon me?
What camera are you using?
I've got the Sony A7S.
A7S. It should let you work in half or third stops.
I'll work on it.
Yeah, you have to look that one. You have to look in the manual. We've all got to keep a copy of the manual with these cameras.
I got to buy a manual.
Well, it should be a PDF online. So look online, but look there. And that's, you know, that's a really good discovery then. If you're only in whole stops, you saw how much even 2/3 of a stop underexposed did. You got to figure out how to use your camera to get that access to that half or third stops to get more accuracy out of it.
The only thing I saw change on yours was the exposure time.
Yeah.
And that's why I was curious. So
yeah, with this bracket of 3, I've picked an aperture that keeps everything in focus how I want. So I'm not changing that. I'm shooting at 100 ISO, which gives me the most dynamic range of the sensor. That's a whole discussion for another time. And then I'm just moving the shutter speed to try to get that exposure more to the right or more to the left where I want. And then as
Okay.
Rick pointed out, that changes how the water flows. So that's a third problem. If I don't like how the water is at the correct exposure, I got to go back and either change the aperture or change the ISO to
Yeah.
make it fit.
Okay.
So it's a complicated dance every time we're photographing between all those elements.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions?
Got
Rich?
one. I've got one for Rich, Bob. Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
Earlier, Rick and y'all were talking about like standard or neutral
Mhm.
for the picture control settings, like in a camera.
Yeah.
When you're chasing the histogram, and of course you're talking about chasing the blinkies now. And I was wondering in that picture control setting, if it was set to monochrome, even though it's not true black and white, would I even fill up the sensor more being in a monochrome mode on my camera?
Well, it's more not whether you'll fill up the sensor more, because you either fill it up or you don't. Those settings just determine how accurate the blinkies or the histogram are. So it's not actually filling up the sensor more, it's showing you the preview with more accuracy or less accuracy. So it won't, in the end, if you're in RAW, it won't, if you're to the right, you're to the right. It doesn't matter what those are. It's just choosing one that's not as vivid or contrasty will make it easier to find that right and have less move and make those blinkies more accurate.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Definitely.
Wow.
It's a lot of moving pieces on our cameras now, so
Yeah.
makes lots of questions.
Anyone else? Well, Rich, you've given us a lot to think about. And as usual, we can call you at any time, day or night, to get clarification on this, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But,
just give them your number and then
we'll head to your website and do some research on that as well.
definitely happy for, if you've got a follow-up question, happy to email, send me an email, happy to answer as I can. And because
Right.
we just hit the first level of all this, and the goal is to see, does it make a difference? I've seen that it really does. That the fact that from 2/3 of a stop, we're down to 1/3 of the potential to the sensor. Actually, that's something just this
Yeah.
week was added to this presentation, and my jaw is still kind of on the floor that little a move. So there's definitely lots of follow-up and application from here. But
Yeah.
thanks. I'll say, well, we can still take questions, but thanks everybody for coming tonight, and hope I gave you some valuable things to think about and ways to improve. And just want to say again how much it's changed my processing. Everything just happens so much easier by paying attention to this. Once you get dialed in, it's easier to expose, not harder. It just takes spending a little effort to learn how to do that. But once you do it, it just becomes like autopilot. So I hope it gives you some good things, and hope we get some good fall color, and can't wait to see you all again at the next meeting.
Starting tomorrow. It's going to be a great process to learn. Just a reminder to everyone, if there's parts of this that maybe you'd like to go back over, our exclusive Facebook page for BPG will have this video on it in a couple of days. Jeremy usually is the one that will post it on there, and he plans to do that, but maybe it'll take a day or so more than it normally does. But be looking for that if you have questions about this. And Rich, as usual, you've done a tremendous job, and can't thank you enough for sharing this information with our group.
Thank you, Bob, so much. Glad to share, and glad to be with you guys.
Okay, thanks again.
All right, have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, Rich.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.